These are some of my favorite birds in the world. They're kingfishers, and they're awesome. They have giant heads for the size of their bodies. They've got beaks like daggers. They catch fish that are almost as big as they are, and they come in all kinds of cool colors. There are 116 or 117 different species around the world, and they're found on every continent. Well, except Antarctica. Sorry, Antarctica. But at least you have penguins. Anyway, they're called kingfishers, but they don't all fish. But I want to concentrate on the ones that do, because I want to talk about, well, that.
Kingfishers dive at roughly 20 to 30 miles an hour into the water. When I talk about this project, I liken it to the equivalent of belly flopping, and belly flopping hurts, right? It doesn't tickle to belly flop. So that seems like something you wouldn't repeatedly engage in if you had a choice. But I always take it a weird step back and I think of, what did that first baby kingfisher think when it was standing on a branch over the water and it went in the water? That's a crazy thing to do. You are not adapted to be underwater. You can't breathe underwater, so why don't you drown? You don't know there's food under the water because you don't have any experience under there. So why would you do that? Why? And why would it happen a whole bunch of times? And then why aren't there consequences from it? Why aren't you scrambling your brain?
So that's Shannon Hackett. She is the Associate Curator of Birds at the Field Museum in Chicago. And along with some other scientists, she has studied the genes of 30 different kingfisher species to help learn how these birds developed this diving ability and what changes in their genes allow them to dive over and over without scrambling their brains. And when I say they dive over and over, I'm serious. These black and white pied kingfishers in Lake Victoria need to eat an average of around 83 fish per day, according to a 1994 study of their diet. That means even if they were successful on every single dive, they'd hit the water that hard 83 times per day. And they do it for a long time because they live for a long time. Kingfishers can live 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So how are they doing that and not getting concussions?
This is part of what Dr. Hackett and her colleagues were studying. First, they wanted to figure out if kingfishers that do dive developed the ability to dive from a single ancestor, or if diving developed multiple times via multiple relations.
So basically, you and I, we have opposable thumbs, and so do chimpanzees and monkeys. And we got that from a common ancestor. But other traits that are the same in different animals develop independently, but the animals still wind up with similar talents. Bats and dolphins, for example, can both use echolocation, but they didn't get that from the same ancestor. The ability to do this developed independently, but both species still wound up with the sound bouncing ability. Turns out the diving kingfishers developed their super speed diving in a way that's more like the dolphins and the bats. In fact, their ability to dive happened at 4 different spots on the family tree. So this ability developed 4 different times from 4 totally different ancestors.
The scientists looked at the genes of the kingfishers from these 4 branches to try to figure out why, to see if there were similar changes that could point to why they can do all this diving while still protecting their brains.
We know that, at least in vertebrates, that if you smash your head against something, you can have traumatic brain consequences. At the time it started, I was the concussion manager of my son's hockey team. So at that time, I got really interested in what repeated head trauma did, at least to kids. There's some breakdown in how proteins are working in the brains. I made this guess that tau proteins, the proteins that seem to break down in human brains, there might be a compensation in the evolution of tau proteins that could either fix the things that might happen inside of a brain that undergoes trauma or might prevent that in the first place.
In kingfishers that dive, The scientists found that a gene that controls the creation and management of these tau proteins was different than in the kingfishers that don't dive. This gene is called MAPT. When MAPT is working right, it helps other birds not get concussions. For example, woodpeckers. They don't get concussions when they're slamming their heads against trees, in part due to this gene's function. They're not quite sure how it works yet in kingfishers, but the scientists want to study it further.
So this clued us in that these proteins really might be a critical aspect of how kingfishers can ameliorate the effects of repetitive head trauma. And that obviously has interest just across birds, it might, but it obviously has an ability to give us insight into what might be happening in humans.
That's because these tau proteins are also important in humans. They support healthy brain function. But when too much tau develops, that can be bad. Big buildups of these proteins have been found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients and in the brains of American football players who have developed CTE. Shannon Hackett hopes that by continuing to study how these proteins work in kingfisher brains, we might learn more about how to help humans.
Now we got to go further before we can understand what the actual physical consequences of this are in birds. Now we have a direction to look, and that may have profound implications for how we look at, maybe how we treat or even understand what happens in humans. Evolution has been going on for 4.5 billion years, and there's lots of natural experiments that have happened that if we understand the tree of life and we understand what's going on, we can maybe use what we learn in these natural evolutionary experiments to solve a human condition.
As Hackett and other scientists start to understand kingfishers better, it could help humans. After all, kingfishers have helped humans solve problems before. Their beaks were used as the basis for bullet trains. But that's a story for another video. For now, we get to just keep enjoying them diving, which is pretty awesome. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next month for another adventure in the natural world.